All right, welcome back. This is going to be the last part of the notes on Chapter 3. Remember that on Thursday we're going to have the quiz over Chapter 3. I'll get that to Mrs. Metter. And the packet for Chapter 3 will also be due on Thursday. So we'll get into today. We're going to basically talk about some social patterns that exist in the colonies during this time, particularly obviously in the New England northern colonies and then the southern colonies as well. So let's start with the South. Um, so on plantations, um, you obviously have elaborate systems of masters and slaves. We talked about this already in Chapter 2, how the slave culture exists in the South, and we're going to get into that a little bit more here today, right? And again, it depends on the type of slave owner. There were slave owners that granted freedom to their slaves after after a period of time or upon their death or whatever. Now, sometimes they would end up enslaved with somebody else, but there's certainly instances where not only would you find free blacks in the North, but sometimes in the South as well. An important term that I want to give you that you might read in the book and not know what it means is the term manumission. This is another word for freedom from slavery, manumission. So if you ever see that term, it pops up here and there, that's what it means. It's basically when a slave is given manumission of slavery, it's just another term used to tell them that they've been given their freedom. Okay, so in the South, it's of course a largely plantation-based economy. In every southern area, the plantation is the dominant thing that keeps people employed, that keeps the economy rolling. The southern economy is almost entirely dependent upon plantations. Okay, essentially a plantation, because they take up so much land and so much so much acreage. They're essentially communities unto themselves, and everybody kind of in a particular plantation rarely would go see people or know many people outside that plantation. That includes wives and mothers and children, and obviously slaves, and then hands, or people that work on a plantation. One thing to understand about the plantation economy, while yes, slavery was prevalent, obviously there were also employees. There were also people that worked on plantations and sometimes lived on them while also getting paid. They would be the foremen. They would be the people in charge of the slaves when the owner, or the slave, or the master, so to speak, wouldn't be the one there watching them, him or himself for the most part. Just like any other place, even today, when a plantation fails, usually as the result of a few bad seasons, it wasn't uncommon for a plantation to go under, for them to go out of business, for them to have to sell off their slaves to make payments. That's the thing about agriculture. If you have a few bad seasons, it can totally derail you economically and ruin any chance for you to kind of grow personally with your wealth and things of that nature. So plantation economy is still risky because it's so dependent upon the weather and the seasons and how that's going to work out. You have one bad season or two bad seasons in a row, you could be in real trouble. So let's talk a little bit about the culture in the plantation, the slave culture in the plantation in particular. This is where we start to see African American culture start to emerge, and it's kind of a blending of cultural aspects they brought over from Africa, as well as the Christianity that they've learned while in captivity with the white man. So basically, it assimilates aspects of both cultures and African religions, as well as Christianity. So when we see in music, if you look at church hymns and things like that, usually in the bottom of a hymnal it says when the song was written. A lot of the most popular songs, um, a lot of the most popular songs that we sing at church are African American spirituals, and many of them were written during the era of captivity, the era of slavery. So that faith is an important piece that keeps these slaves going again during their time of captivity, and that's something important to note because it's something that's going to keep them alive and keep them going, right? I've talked before. I talked last week about how the culture on plantations had slaves acting as like one big surrogate family. Elder males in slave populations would take care of the younger children. The eldest women on plantations would take care of the children and would act almost as parental figures because so often children were separated from their birth parents when sold into slavery. So it was kind of like an unwritten rule that the older women and men on a particular plantation had the responsibility of kind of taking care of and raising younger children as if they were their own. Now, one significant event to talk about here is something called the Stono Rebellion. Now, the Stono Rebellion occurs in 1739 in South Carolina. You see, one thing to understand about slaves that are captured is they have rich histories back in Africa. And it so happened that a slave by the name of Cato, at least history calls him Cato, was a member of the Congolese military, and he and some other African slaves with military experience stage this big rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion. And this was probably the most notable rebellion of the colonial period. There would be others after the United States is formed, but this is the most notable rebellion. Of course, at the end of the day, it fails. The objective was to escape from South Carolina into Florida, which at that point was controlled by the Spanish, and get their freedom there, but ultimately they were unsuccessful. However, again, when we're talking about cause and effect, the Stono Rebellion is important, even though ultimately the leaders, Cato and whoever else, ultimately are captured and hanged or killed. We see that the whites realize that we need to kind of change our laws and attitudes towards the slave populations a little bit. Otherwise, these sort of things are going to keep happening. And the outcome, the cause and effect of the Stono Rebellion is that it would ultimately lead to less harsh laws towards slaves. Now again, still terrible because slavery still exists, but the rebellion forces slave owners to take another look at the conditions of slavery and say, what can we do to prevent another Stono Rebellion from happening? At the end of the day, there was probably about 80 people killed, 70 to 80 people killed in total between whites and blacks in this rebellion. But it stands out as the most significant slave rebellion in colonial America, and led to some kind of slave owners taking another look at the laws and loosening them a little bit to look a little bit less like Barbados slave codes, and laws that are going to hopefully be less harsh and prevent future slave rebellions from occurring. It works for a time, but in the long run, it does not. Now, let's take a look at some of the patterns of society that exist in the northern colonies. Again, what I really want you to understand is, how are the colonies differing? What are the big differences between the northern colonies and the southern colonies? Because this is really important. Even though we're 13 colonies and ultimately will become 13 states, they're two very different worlds. And not just because of the slavery thing, but the general aspects of life itself, how marriage works. We talked about that the other day. How various aspects of society work, where the positions of women are, religious significance. Obviously, religious significance is much greater in the Puritan New England colonies than it is in the southern colonies, right? These Puritan communities are very, very close knit. In each Puritan town, and I'll show you a picture later, in each Puritan town you have at the center of town a church, and a church acts as a town center. It's a place where people go meet, and mayors or political leaders will talk to the community about whatever's bothering them or whatever issues need to be discussed. Because faith is at the center, whether or not we agree with every aspect of the Puritan faith and its strictness, is certainly another argument. But the point is, all these people come into town, come into these communities, and really develop this tight bond. In contrast, in the South, you have people isolated, living on plantations, women or others rarely venturing off the plantation or meeting other people. The only people that really do are men, slave masters, or masters or plantation owners, or people like that. Okay? What it creates is a system of participatory democracy. Everybody in the New England colonies kind of gets a vote, gets an opportunity to say what they think, and ultimately that's how decisions are made. It's a democratic system similar to what existed in ancient Greece, and again, it's something that at least helps in the development of our own system here in the United States. We don't have a full participatory democracy, but we have a representative democracy where elected officials are elected to theoretically act on the wants and needs of their community. Okay, and that's essentially what we're talking about here. These close-knit communities, a participatory democracy, it's all a sense of all these people working to achieve a common goal. And this is why these societies in the North succeed a little bit better than the ones in the South do, which are more isolated, which are more obviously supportive of morally ambiguous issues like slavery and things like that. Okay, now in the with the town councils, people have more of a collective voice, which is good. So we see a lot of positive patterns that come up in the New England communities. Okay, there's also the downside too, and this is played out in the famous Salem witch trials in the 1690s. Okay, now the Salem witch trials, basically going back to the John Winthrop shining city upon a hill ideology. What is the one thing that the shining city upon a hill will not tolerate is dissent. Okay, in other words, anything that seems different from the norm. So here's the story of the Salem witch trials. Basically, a couple girls were learning like voodoo and tarot games from a Jamaican servant woman who lived with their family. She told them about witches and the occult and stuff of that nature. And these girls, basically upset with one of their teachers, made a claim that that their teacher was a witch. Everybody freaked out. Everybody said, oh my gosh, we have witches here and it's bad. And it becomes a literal witch hunt. We've heard that term before, witch hunt, where we try to make up something about somebody. At the end of the day, the Salem witch trials results in the hanging of 19 women. Okay, so 19 women are hanged and killed. And they use these witch trials as basically a way to root out women that didn't quite fit what we call the strict social construct of Puritan Massachusetts, right? You have this very strict social construct, meaning a way with which society is supposed to work. People that don't fit into the construct, i.e. don't fit into the ideology of the shining city upon a hill, need to be gotten rid of, need to be sent away. Okay, and the way they do this um, because this excuse of witchcraft leads to people's lives being lost because of that fear. Okay, so it leads to the hanging of 19 women. It creates a general fear of witchcraft, which results in many other accusations of people that fortunately ended up with them not being killed. Um, and ultimately, at the end of the day, the two girls responsible for making up this story way back at the beginning about how their teacher was a witch, um, they ultimately recanted the story, said they made the whole thing up. Okay, what does this show you about this pattern of society in colonial Massachusetts or New England? It says while it's good that you have these close-knit communities and you have a participatory democracy, the negative comes from the ideology that anybody that doesn't fit into this strict social construct is somehow not good enough and needs to be dealt with in a, unfortunately, often violent and destructive fashion. So here's the downside of the patterns of society that exist in these tight-knit communities of New England. You also have lots of little cities within each um, Puritan community. Um, Again, these people are able to develop these cities through communication, through working together, through trying to achieve these common goals. These little towns grow to become cities, and cities, in some cases, grow to become major metropolises, right? Such as, Boston began as a small town. New York City begins as a small town. Philadelphia, so on and so forth. Over time, as more people get to these places, they grow larger and more influential. We talked about education yesterday already. Um, in terms of industry, we do start to see a little bit of industry pop up in the north. There's very little industry in the south, right? Um, Lots of silversmiths and blacksmiths and carpenters and things like that, which are small-time industries. But you do see, some industries like ironworks and distilleries. Lots of the you can distill down sugar and get rum out of it to make alcohol to make rum, and we start to see these crop up throughout the north, um, and that's your first little bit of industry. So it's growing slowly, it's making itself present, but there is more industry certainly in the north than the south. Same thing with education. Um, There's more school in the north than the south, more colleges in the north than the south. It's more of a society that is focused on educating their young people. And, this would be the case for a very, very long time. As long as the plantation economy exists in the south, the need for education and educating young people is going to be less prevalent or important to society. Again, so this is what a small city looks like typically. Look at, you have lots of common areas and areas where people can come together and do things, and do things in a community sense, right? This is the New England town of Sudbury, Massachusetts. I've actually been there, and lots of fields, lots of areas. You have mills, it's a little bit of industry. Streets here, you're going to find churches, probably kind of right in the center. In the common, this is what we're talking about when we see um, places where people live and buildings and things of that nature. So um, they're small towns, they're very tightly knit. People don't own a whole lot of land, but everybody kind of works together to gain, um, essentially, to gain a better life. All right. So, what is the bottom line for Chapter 3? As time goes on, colonial identity continues to grow. The British, happy with the financial gains they make from the triangular trade, allow the colonies self-governance. This ultimately proves to be a mistake as the colonists become used to self-government. leading, of course, to the revolution. Salutary neglect, the British ignore the colonies from a political perspective, and then once the French and Indian War happens and they start to want to get involved, the colonists say, no, we know what we're doing. We're running our own show. We don't need your help here. So the British create their own nightmare, essentially, they create their own nightmare, essentially, in allowing the colonies to govern themselves for so long. Now, on the other side, on the other hand, the social and cultural rift between northern and southern colonies is becoming more apparent. Of course, the consequences of this in the long term will be dire for the U.S. Of course, this is in reference to the American Civil War. So we're already seeing the differences and the rifts that are going to create a horrible conflict for this country, being born already way back when, right? As soon as the people start coming in, we're seeing these differences really start to emerge. So that's the end of chapter 3. I'll give you a little bit longer to finish writing that all down or getting it all, and then we'll be done here. So thanks for listening. Again, let me know if you have any questions regarding Chapter 3 or the quiz on Thursday. And certainly good luck with that. And probably Thursday evening, I'll send you a video with the beginning of the notes for Chapter 4. All right. We'll talk to you later.